Welcome to Consensus on Reality. We're here today to discuss a few astral topics from fairies to Mahatmas and beyond. This is the public portion of the episode, which will be followed by an equally fascinating Patreon section of the episode, which you can access at patreon.com/consensusunreality, where for $5 a month, you can access our entire archive of episodes and new Patreon exclusive episodes and other things.
Yes, big things upcoming too. We're super excited about a new aspect that we've kind of been teasing, and I think we'll be ready to announce it maybe on the next episode. That will be included in our $10 a month tier, but it's going to be super worth it and amazing. As Ben mentioned, just $5 a month gets you access to all of our exclusive episodes and full episode archive. Tons of stuff on there that is not hosted on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple. It's only on Patreon, and you could use that RSS feed wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. One thing I was reminded of is our Saucers of Despair series of episodes that we did last fall, and this episode kind of fits neatly into that topical region, I think. Do you agree, Ben?
I do. What I've been realizing, looking deeper into pre-UFO theosophical and I guess fairy lore, is just how similar they really are. Obviously, people like Josh Cutchin have done this work in very deep ways, especially in his Ecology of Souls. But it's kind of interesting going firsthand to see, exactly what kind of influence this turn of the century, last century milieu of like theosophists, anthropologists, like these sort of people investigating older religions as industrialization kind of reached its climax, I guess. We're seeing like this interesting look both backwards into the past of Western religion and culture, and also a look eastward, obviously, in stuff like theosophy and things like that. So, yeah, there's a lot to be said between all these things. The UFO as sort of an evolution of these older sort of land-based or local kind of mythologies, and theosophy, of course. I've been looking at the Mahatma Letters to AP Sinnett, which are crazy, and kind of a really big pivot point in the history of theosophy as well. Blavatsky, H.P. Blavatsky, who with, what's his name? Olcott. I don't remember his first initials, though, but the founders of theosophy, they kind of were accused of fraud along with every other kind of spiritualist. And Blavatsky was interesting in that she admitted to fraud to a certain extent and said that, well, sometimes you have to fake things in order to like get the ball rolling on these spiritual endeavors.
Yeah, it's such a big part of the topics we talk about too, right? And that came up a lot in the spiritualism conversation.
Yeah, but it was happening all the way through. And then, of course, the Mahatma Letters were also accused of being sort of a Blavatsky fraud. And they're weird. I watched a quick little Theosophical Society documentary about the sort of history of the letters and their role in the foundation. And I guess like they had this sort of, not a scientist, but they had a scholar of like handwriting or someone like that look at the letters, and the theosophical position is that they kind of like apported onto the page, like they kind of like the ink kind of like grew out of the page, or like when there was a mistake, it was like lifted spiritually off the page and then written over again, creating this weird like palimpsest kind of look to some of the letters. And of course, like skeptics are like, no, it's obviously just like somebody like messing with their handwriting and writing like these letters. But the content of the letters are pretty interesting too. Huge for the kind of stuff that Space Brothers would say to people, very similar to sort of absolute unity, like reincarnation type stuff. So, they were influential in theosophy, of course, but it's interesting, like looking now at how they might have influenced stuff that like Adamski or some of the other early contactees were hearing from these people. So they were from Kut Humi, often referred to as KH, and Moria, often just M. And I guess Kut Humi and Moria were extremely tall, very tall Hindu fellas. And
these are like ascended masters now.
yeah, and that's another really sort of interesting part about that theosophical stuff is that we're really to assume that they are to some extent physical people. Like these are people somewhere, but they have this aspect of them where they've kind of mastered the cycle of reincarnation and are able to kind of, yeah, I mean, I guess that's why they call them, masters. They're sort of above, but also inside of the world. And that's a really interesting aspect of all this. And it all kind of started because Blavatsky met with AP Sinnett in India, where he was kind of stationed for a job for like a colonial newspaper. And the Blavatsky stayed with the Sinnetts, him and his wife, and he kind of converted to theosophy. And he said, "Can I write a letter to one of these masters of yours?" And she said, "Sure, and I'll deliver it to them." And then this correspondence began, which sort of forms the basis of all this.
Mm.
So it's kind of been really interesting looking into this chapter in the theosophical story because it's important and people talk about it, but it doesn't often get included in like looking at the scope of like Blavatsky and then it getting passed on to Leadbeater and
Besant, yeah.
Besant, and stuff like that, like the American branch, and like Judge and some of the other post Blavatsky theosophists. So yeah, it's a kind of a weird chapter that's sort of marginal, but also central. So yeah, that's been wild, wild stuff.
Yeah, that's funny. You've been looking at that. Was that because I talked about the Leadbeater with you a little bit, or were you just kind of independently looking at that stuff?
It just came into the shop. Like I got a big, a couple crates of books that I bought. Someone brought them in, kind of dusty old stuff, and one of them was just this really nice 70s edition of the Mahatma Letters, and I'd never like wanted to like spring to buy it myself, so I thought, well, I'll just keep this copy for me. And so yeah, kind of serendipitously arrived. And yeah, you mentioned looking at some of the theosophical stuff, and that kind of, I was like, maybe it's a good time to just read it, or at least try.
Yeah, and we've talked about Besant and Leadbeater. I forget the specifics of when, although I'm sure we've mentioned them on a couple episodes.
Probably thought forms.
Thought forms for sure. But yeah, I was listening to an audiobook of Theosophical Manual number 5, The Astral Plane, Its Scenery, Inhabitants, and Phenomena, from 1896 by Charles Webster Leadbeater. It's a really, it's obviously very relative to the kind of topics that we've been talking about lately, especially contextualizing the UFO question, the UFO as a religious object, but certainly the UFO as representing or being instrumental towards man's evolution, I think is something that's really seems to almost be derived from this book. Not that it starts there, but he does conceptualize this in an early way, and I'm sure that Jung must have been influenced by this kind of stuff as well, because there's some of the descriptions of the astral plane and its inhabitants really seems to be related to the kind of things that Jung was looking at later in his life, specifically that concept of the psychoidal, which we spoke about on a recent episode. But there's also,
Yeah, I wonder if you read theosophical literature. Is there anything on like Jung's relationship to that kind of stuff? I mean, obviously, it was popular in Germany to some extent, or at least the Ariosophic branch of it was was popular. And so I wonder, yeah, if there was. I assume he must
I have
have because of
absolutely no doubt, and I
yeah,
feel that I don't want to say with certainty, but I do feel that I've read things that would indicate that he has read a good deal of theosophical literature.
yeah,
But there's it's a very like the language of this book is I really enjoyed how direct it is, and that it is like it's a manual, so it's written as kind of this like survey
mm,
of the astral, and the language is quite plain and direct, but there are statements in there that really seem prophetic of the kind of conversations that we're currently having about non-human intelligence and the possibility of this other sentience, this independent sentient consciousness that has been with us since the inception of our own consciousness, right? Or civilization
yeah,
or something along those lines. But yeah, it really conjures ideas that Strieber is talking about, with the contact with the Greys, as being or having to do with mankind's evolution. This is something that Leadbeater
yeah,
talks about in this manual, as the elemental essence as belonging to man's evolution. And that the evolution of the astral will show emanations in the mineral or the material. So there's kind of this
mm,
Trismegistus, like as above, so below, uh, you know, concourse between these two planes, and not that there's just two, in a Gnostic type sense. It goes further and further up from the astral. So the astral
yeah,
is kind of like exists as a sort of filter into the material. And this is also something I encountered in Al-Kindi's treatise on stellar rays, which is Al-Kindi was like the father of Arab philosophy. This specific treatise really was influential to John Dee. That's kind of how I encountered it.
mm,
Al-Kindi was born in 801 AD, so this is going quite a ways back before Leadbeater. But there's also this idea that stellar rays are the agent responsible for all causation within the universe, and they come from the plane of the divine, and then they affect and emanate in elements of the material world, which is something that we can expand upon. But there is always this concept of light and energy, and I feel like this top down from alien like encounters, astral light encounters, but also in the fairy encounters too. There's always a relationship to light and
yeah.
emanating through light, right?
At least often, I think. There's this really interesting interview in the fairy faith in Celtic countries, which maybe we can talk a bit about now, where he's talking to like an Irish mystic and he describes, I'm not sure if he gives the name of who the mystic was, but this mystic who he's interviewing describes like these fairy entities are of like two classes, some of which are shining beings and the others are opalescent.
Mm, hmm.
And so they're both like they have this quality of light which describes them. Along with a kind of interesting idea that you don't see them with your physical eyes. You kind of, it's a different sort of sight with which you see them. And sight comes up a lot in this book, which I found really interesting. Because I had not read this before. And I've been kind of looking through the book and also listening to the audiobook, which is very calming and very like
Yeah,
pleasant to listen to.
it is great. Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, it's soothing stuff. But, and then I looked into it. And so it's written by Walter Evans-Wentz, who I have confused with something Evans Pritchard, who's a anthropologist type historian guy who's British. But so the audiobook's read in sort of like a sort of English Isles accent of some sort. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but and then but Evans Wentz is from Trenton, New Jersey, which is hilarious to me.
And
So
he
he was
has
kind of
a.
traveling.
I'm just kind of remembering now. Actually, this is a funny coincidence,
Yeah,
but he has a deep relationship to theosophy, right? And
he was a theosophist. Yeah, like it happened, and that you can kind of see that in this book. You see his relationship that's like developing with theosophy, kind of come into how he interprets. He almost takes like a kind of it's antiquated now, but like a psychical approach to the fairy thing. He calls it like a psychological approach. So it's almost like this weird cross between like anthropological work, like field work, and theosophical leaning psychical research. It's really a kind of beautiful book. But this thing keeps coming up where you can only see fairies with one eye,
mm-hmm.
which is like struck me as really interesting. I guess it was mostly in Ireland where he found this, but yeah, the fairy would like ask which eye you can see me out of. He would ask the witness that, and when he found out which one it was, he would then disappear. Like you'd close one eye, and there would the fairy wouldn't be there, and you'd open the other, and he would. And all these little details about the fairy encounters. We kind of talked about it when we did that episode with Mike Bruno like a few years ago, and we looked at some of those Eddie Lenahan stories about fairies. This feels similar to that in some ways. Like,
Mm-hmm. And of course, Robert Kirk, which he also mentions,
yeah,
and kind of
yeah,
retraces some of the area in which Robert Kirk lived and died.
yeah, and vanished into the fairy realm, I
Mm-hmm.
guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, it's great, and he covers Ireland first, and then Scotland, and then Wales, Cornwall, and like all of these places. And it's really interesting how often people refer to fairies as like really having a lot to do with people who are dead or like people who died but who have still time on Earth. So there's a way more of like a ghost presence, which again kind of evokes the research Josh Cutchin is doing in his work. This idea that the dead are inextricably linked to both fairy and UFO encounters. And
Passport to Magonia as well, obviously. Yeah.
that, yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the more I look at the fairy stuff, when I dip back into it every now and then, that really does seem like the best interpretation of what is happening with UFOs. It explains the most. Not that we know what fairies are, like, so it doesn't really explain anything, but the similarities there are so striking and weird.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel comfortable jumping around a bunch because we'll be able to backtrack into some of that theosophical stuff. But an interesting thing is um, in fairy lore, there is like fairy artifacts, right? Like a little
Yeah,
shoe or things of that nature that are kind of apported right into existence from this para realm. Um, and listening to Diana Pasulka on Joe Rogan
oh yeah,
this week, um,
that's crazy.
I feel it is crazy. And obviously, we've talked about the two Pasulka books a lot on the show because they're kind of at this inflection point of all of these things. But there, what she's talking about a lot with David Grush and these quote unquote crash sites is that they're actually like what the Invisible College would refer to these as actually donations. So it's not
Yeah,
necessarily the idea that these these goofy aliens crashed their ship in New Mexico and here we are
totally.
going through the pieces. It's really more the idea that these things are kind of seeded, like these technological abstract objects are seeded into our material world and we're kind of left to decipher them. And yeah, a really interesting revelation in listening to that Pasulka interview was that an industry term for these metamaterials, which are like these engineered um, metals that have properties that are not like earthly and kind of have like all of these technological implications of being like superconductors and um, we're kind of literally reverse engineering some of these donations, these metamaterials, and the only way that we can begin to try and construct some of these things is like in a state of zero gravity, which is really weird. I mean, but that's what when Grush said we have biologics. It's such an odd term because you think like that means we have bodies of aliens, but it really is
Yeah,
referring to these like anomalous materials. It seems like a cagey industry term to do that in the first place,
yeah.
right?
It always struck me that way. Maybe it's like an alien's tooth or something, or like yeah, the kind of thing a fairy might leave behind, like a clip of hair or something weird like that. It's yeah. Um,
But I guess I bring that up also because listening to this audio of the Evans-Wentz Fairy Faith book, one thing to point out is that with fairy encounters, there's usually a standoffishness towards mankind, and when there is an interaction, it's usually outright trickery. Um,
yeah,
I don't really hear, or I'm not sure I've heard encounters where the fairies seem to be like assisting the progress of mankind in any way, which is the conversation
yeah.
of this UFO donation type thing.
They're kind of like fickle. Like they'll help individual people if they do them a favor. Like they reward proper ritual acknowledgement. They reward that. They reward if you leave a bit of milk behind for them, or if you steer clear of their property. Um, or if you like, they'll often need like somebody to play a certain instrument for their band or something
Right,
like that
right.
kind of thing. Like, and then like they take somebody's hump off of their back, like this crazy like they do these sort of strange otherworldly things to people that I guess are not that different from the kinds of things that aliens will do, as well as the kind of like curses that the aliens will put upon people, like the invasions of the body, the weird radiation type sickness people get after seeing a UFO. All of that stuff seems very fairy punishment or reward type behavior. And so, yeah, I wonder if that really tracks with where the UFO conversation is today. It seems like it at least could. Um,
With the
Another
abduction
strange thing
phenomena,
in the
for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yes, and the vehicles thing is strange because there are like ferry vehicles, but I guess that could just be a case of the thing changing with our understanding of space and time. It wouldn't really make sense for like a marching gang of fairies to appear to us today because that's not the way people move anymore exactly. Like people move in craft of various sorts almost exclusively. Well, not exclusively, but you know what I mean. Like, yeah. Something else in the Wentz Evans-Wentz book I thought was interesting was how often the fairies have these like battles. Um, how often people report overhearing like swords and like battles and huge armies clashing like on beaches, and then there's like no evidence of it later, like these crazy ghostly battles. And that's something I don't really know. I mean, is it possible that the kind of UFO crashes that we see are just like the result of something that we is not involved with us at all? Like, it has nothing to do with us, and we just happen to sometimes be able to see the physical remnants of it, I guess.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I don't know. It seems people aren't quite, it doesn't even seem this way. It is that people haven't been willing to disclose direct information about the quote unquote crash sites. But Pasulka in this interview this week, she's reiterating that, from like the 1940s, there is like 3 sites of these kind of donations containing these materials, and it does go with some of the stuff in the Corso book about that material that was supposedly recovered at Roswell, that the metal can retain
Yeah.
its like its shape once it is like reformed or something, like it has that reflexive property.
And like fiber optics were supposed to have gotten like, yeah, all the stuff that Corzo claims we received from that crash. Yeah, Corzo is a fascinating figure still to me. I am not really like settled on him. Most people kind of accept he's some sort of psyop or hoaxer or whatever, but I am not really sure about him at all. He's a strange, strange like example in this field, I think.
Yeah, and admittedly, like when it comes to the more nuts and bolts, like recovery of objects, although I'm not sure how nuts and bolts it is. Like I said, like the whole donations thing seems to work with the UFO as interdimensional apport kind of theory that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't necessarily have a clear opinion on it because there's convincing information from so many sides of the kaleidoscopic object of ufology. But
Yeah.
I would say the whole, I don't know, the conspiratorial angle of it all being that Mirror Man psyop seems less convincing at this time. That it does feel that there is, I don't know, there is something. Like, it's not to just say, oh, there's something going on, because yes, obviously there's something that's been going on forever, but like even the kind
Yeah.
of the metamaterials and stuff, I don't know, it's like there's pretty open conversations going on about these things, and not knowing where they came from, but that they seem to be clearly engineered and engineered beyond our capabilities and scientific knowledge. It's not that this is just like hearsay. Like there's, you could watch like seminars of people like talking about what these objects are and what the implications of them are and stuff. So I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
strange.
what would it mean if they're interdimensional though? I mean, it falls apart for me there because it often doesn't seem like people really know what that means. Like they use that as a phrase to like refer to something, but what is an interdimensional object? Like that doesn't make any sense. You can't if it's like we wouldn't be able to experience an interdimensional object in a recognizable way. I don't think we could because we exist in the three dimensions, and I guess if time is the fourth, we exist in this changing, decaying, three-dimensional experience. So what would a fifth dimensional object even
5D
like how could that
consciousness.
land
We're hitting it.
how could it land in
5D
a desert?
awareness, bro.
Like
We're lifted.
because like wouldn't that mean it's outside of time? And if it's outside of time, then it would be like the object would be would always be here at this in the same place throughout all of time, and we wouldn't be able to interact with it.
Yeah.
Or is that, I mean, obviously, I'm not like a scientist or a theoretical physicist, but
Well,
if that's what,
I hate to we're getting Rogan minutes on here. We're not even an hour in. I would say Rogan hours, but we're like 30 in. But like, I mean, that kind of also, it has weirdly, you can look at it with the whole quantum physics thing of like, things are different with the tools that you're observing them. So, if
sure,
consciousness is the tool in that, then maybe we've just been able to observe them at this point or something, I don't know.
yeah, like one aspect of it.
But isn't there like there's that famous Sagan thing where he's talking about like higher dimensional objects, and we're kind of existing on this flat plane at the time as a flat circle
Yeah.
thing.
I
But
mean,
we wouldn't
yeah,
be able to
flatland,
perceive like yeah.
right. Yeah, that was illustrated well in that early novel, science fiction-ish novel, Flatland. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Yeah.
It's cool we
So
got
the
5D
dimensional
awareness
thing,
in so early though.
the dimensional thing is like, what is how is that term being used? Because there's like a popular connotation of multidimensional reality is, what dimensions are, which is kind of poisoned by our media, like Star Trek type stuff, like the character Q, or
Mm.
like someone who can blip in and out of reality, at will. And but that in practice, I don't know. If you're looking at everything really practically, it does all kind of feel like science fiction based very, very much on whatever happened with like the mid 20th century Star Trek, Puharich, Matrix thing, like this, the Nine. It all feels like a kind of just this narrative was born. Um, and then, 1947, all of this stuff kind of was birthed in this weird universe explosion, like a big bang of narrative where we get all of this at the same
we
time.
it,
Of course,
like
that's not true because you can
yeah.
trace it back further, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like this Leadbeater text, the astral plane. One of the most like glaring things that was just sitting there is like he's talking about the non-human inhabitants of the astral plane, and he talks about the winged globes, the fiery wheels of Ezekiel. And he's saying that they are the 4 points of the compass. They are represented by the solar disk, the encircled cross, and they are the agents of man's karma. They were always held as protectors of mankind and play a great part in man's destiny. This is 1896.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's crazy. There's not a whiff of ufology yet. The only thing there is at that point is the airships thing.
Yeah, that's cool.
It's
I
wild.
mean, that's kind of what I mean by it like it stretches back, but it's kind of like it gets this new identity with the dawn of the UFO moment. And that the rise of sci-fi and the rise of whatever these objects are, seeing them really colors our understanding of reality. I guess this is kind of getting into the territory of thinking of them as in the valet sense, like a control system, but also in the like Jason Horsley sense, like a social psychological weapon that is used to direct our understanding of reality and the self. Both might be true or neither, but just the way that this looks in our culture and the way that it functions, it's interesting, yeah, to trace it back from the theosophical stuff, like masters and these sort of the astral plane thought forms through the sort of cultural transformation it experiences by the time we get to now, where you can't really think of UFOs without thinking of the media that inspired it, when really it's like this strange mystical
Yeah.
mystical what like a mystical initiatory like symbolic experience that is what it most really resembles if you look at the actual experiences people have. But then the thing that happens in culture with it is this sort of narrative poisoning, which
Hmm.
is really interesting. But of course, I'm a big fan of the narrative. I love the subculture of it. So it's not a complaint as much as a interesting to track
Yeah.
how
Well,
it gets from astral plane thought forms to you can't think of someone coming from another planet without thinking of the gray alien face. And how that ties into Crowley is, of course, interesting. And I've seen that going around a little bit lately, like Lamb stuff. People have been bringing Lamb back on Twitter,
hmm.
which I guess will age this conversation pretty quickly. But the way Lamb comes back as like, oh, this is, gray aliens were invented by Aleister Crowley, who is the most evil man that ever, like this very naive understanding of Crowley, or I guess it's like that people would invoke that bell curve where it's like uh, a stupid person thinks Crowley is evil, and like a middle tier person thinks that it's actually more nuanced than that, and then the super smart person thinks, oh, Crowley's
Yeah.
evil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I'm
Yeah.
sure that's an easy response, but I think that that's also wrong. Like I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I agree with you. I think like those nefarious human aspects of the whole thing obviously exist and are a part of it. And the narrative function is kind of how we try and understand it, but it is fault. It almost like doesn't just confuse it. Um, I think it kind like it's the healthiest way to look at it is that kind of psychoidal concept in that ufology belongs to the family of visionary experiences, and then it kind
yeah,
of it gets transformed into an archetype, and that's kind of the conversation of so many of these things we look at, and so many of the things that we're looking at just for this episode. Like they talk
right. It's
about
true of fairies too.
exactly fairies, but also even dealing with the astral. Leadbeater's talking so much about how the temporary forms that astral beings take, um, and how they kind of take shape. And even if you think about Ezekiel trying to characterize the visionary experience that he had, but we are left with these drawings of winged angels with the faces of the four cherubim, and the wheels with the eyes on it
Yeah,
and stuff. And it seems to be that maybe putting a face to it at all kind of torpedoes what the thing actually is.
yeah,
And that maybe the story that we tell about the thing doesn't really have to do with the thing at all. Does that make sense? That like I forget.
totally. Yeah, or it is the thing too, and like that's what they want to evoke out of people is a new story or like a iteration of the same story every time. It could just be a amorphous thing that it interacts with us that wants us to like invent new stories for it or something.
Yeah, I do feel that we put human stories to something that is um not human, and in a way that we can't quite understand obviously what exactly it is, but that
Yeah,
we add these absurd stories to it, that then denigrate the narrative, or create this narrative that denigrates the pure essential thing itself, in that it's probably more of an experiential thing. But then it goes back to that whole donations thing, and there can be many separate aspects of it, like existing
yeah,
at one
right.
time, obviously, too, and it might be some comical thing that the fairies are like, well, we don't know what the hell the aliens are either, you know?
Yeah,
Um,
that's true. It could all be, I mean, yeah, everything's so complicated. It could all just have nothing to do with one another. But
yeah. So, but
mm,
Ledbetter talks a lot about this idea of the elemental being this latent force, that is essential to mankind's being, and that we were once elemental, and that the elemental that projects from the astral plane, um, it reflects itself through light, and that's kind of the image that we're seeing. And yeah, that definitely reminds me of that the Jungian stuff we were talking about. I forget if it was last week or the episode before that, but
yeah,
the concept that the archetype that we project onto the visionary experience is not the thing itself, but yeah.
right. Yeah. I wonder, I lost my train of thought, but yeah, the astral stuff, how that, I wonder how influenced like someone like Ledbetter was by like the sort of folklore of his like place, like how obviously like Blavatsky sort of was a synthesizer of different religions
Hmm.
and different philosophies and an inventor to some extent too. And so the sort of less major uh, characters in theosophy, you wonder what they bring to it individually. Like, of course, there's like astral stuff in the more original theosophists, but yeah, like the thought form stuff and this sort of appeal to a more amorphous kind of like psychic approach to theosophy I thought was interesting in what they did like in that American chapter with Bezant and Ledbetter. You wonder, every sort of cult or religion or group will change as it goes through its members. So you wonder where they are today. I guess we could just ask like a member of the Theosophical Society, but
Mm.
I guess what I'm saying
It's
is
hard to
it's
find. I
interesting.
mean, I was looking into, because I know Philadelphia had a Theosophical
Yeah.
Society for the longest time, although it seems to have fragmented a bit. I'm sure it had a lot of older members and stuff. And the New York one, I don't know, seems to have faded a bit too. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I was kind of looking into this stuff, and some of the regional Rosicrucian stuff too, which we'll talk about on the Patreon. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, one of the funny things I encountered in this Ledbetter book too, and talking about how this, like, I felt how prophetic this text was, or at least influential. Um, he talks about how these accidental acts of ceremonial magic can conjure beings who should not know of humanity, and humanity should not know of them.
Hell
That feels like super
yeah.
Lovecraftian, right? And
That's so dark.
although we can speculate how much Jung read of theosophy, we know for a fact that Lovecraft was reading,
Yeah.
as much theosophical literature as he could.
I assume Grant probably took a little bit out of there,
Oh,
either through
absolutely.
Lovecraft
Yeah.
or just I'm sure he just had all these books.
So let's
Yeah, I
peel
love that.
over.
That's so dark.
Yeah, let's
Maybe we
peel over
should
to the Patreon, and we'll talk more about this stuff and
we'll do an opposite Wizard of Oz where we push the curtain back over.
put the curtain back on.
Yeah.
Close the curtain.
We close the curtain. Yeah.
Yeah, go back in front of the curtain. I don't know. I was just thinking that though, like it how we've for the past 3 episodes we've kind of been um really like extracting the kind of or trying to at least, consider the essence of the ufologic. How do you go back to the paperbacks of Space Bros and Little Green Men?
I like it.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, I can go back anytime, but it's a lot more like entertainment than it is like blowing your mind, which is fine. That's what you need sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Can you put the toothpaste back in the tube, I guess, is the question.
I guess if you forget about the toothpaste long enough and it dries out, you can then sort of siphon the powder of the dried toothpaste back into the tube.
There's probably some kind of tool, shoot. Anyway,
Yeah.
patreon.com/consensus unreality. For just $5 a month, get access to our entire archive of episodes, exclusive written content, tons of exclusive episodes, bonus hours on episodes,
And the
Discord server. And as we mentioned at the top, we're going to be introducing some things that we're super, super excited about. So join up, $5 a month. I just spent that on a cup of regular ass coffee this morning because
It's dark out there.
I was in a rush and it was like $5. So if you like what we
Coffee's
do,
pricey.
throw that our way. And thanks for listening, and we'll hop over to the Patreon.
Yeah.
Okay, we're on Patreon.
Patreon listeners, thanks for joining us or for staying. So, how about that new season of True Detective?
No, not yet. Let's do that on the way, way back.
I'm so close to saying True Anon every time I say True Detective. And it's one of these days it's gonna kill me. Um, it's really, really bad, but fine. Uh, I just got pretty cool
This
thing
episode is continued exclusively on patreon.com/consensus unreality. Sign up now for tons of exclusive episodes, full archive, written content, Discord server, and more.